Now, real quickly, I'm just going to give you, for those of you that don't have it from last week, a little outline up at the top of the page to keep you on track while we look. We gave it to you last week, but maybe you don't have it. If you've already got it, you don't need to write it again. First to the 4th century, papyrus, uncial scrolls. First to the 4th, papyrus, uncial scrolls. You can just abbreviate it real quickly. This is about the 3rd or 4th time we've gone over that, so we're not going to spend a lot of time there. 4th to the 10th century, parchment, uncials, codices. Then 10th to the 14th, parchment, minuscules, codices. Then 14th to the 15th, paper. The other things stay the same. What's the subject? The subject is, again, the designation of the manuscripts, which is what we left off right in the middle of, really, or more at the beginning of our studies of the designation of the New Testament manuscripts last week. Now, we said that there were 3 stages. We probably better go back because people were asking me afterwards what superscripts were and Gothic P's and everything, so we'll go back just to review, since it's been a whole week since we studied it last time. Wetstein. There are 3 important names for time periods involved in people thinking up, now how are we going to designate all these manuscripts that we have available? So we gave you the name of Wetstein, Tischendorf, and Gregory. Wetstein, 1693 to 1754, proposed the whole system, or at least the beginning of it. He didn't go very far, but it was further than anyone else had gone in the past, where he was going to designate 2 different groups of manuscripts, the uncials by capital Latin letters, and the minuscules by Arabic numerals. And we also said that you shouldn't just forget about Wetstein because people came after him, for the reason being that no one changes what Wetstein has set forth when he initially began. It's not changes in the area of subtraction, it's changes in the area of addition. They simply add to what he's already given us as being rudiments for the basic system of listing and designating the manuscript. So the uncials, known by capital Latin letters, the minuscules by Arabic numerals. Then, the second man important in this is Constantine Tischendorf. All this so far is just review, 1815 to 1874. And Tischendorf brings 2 important changes in Wetstein's system. The first place, we owe to Tischendorf the discovery of Sinaiticus. And he felt that Codex Sinaiticus was so important and so significant that it deserved some recognition by itself above just the capital Latin letters which had been used under Wetstein's system for all the uncials that were known up to that time. So what did he give Sinaiticus? Aleph, first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which really makes it easy to remember because it's going to set it apart from all other uncials that come after that. Then the second thing that Tischendorf does is he recognizes that by the time he comes on the scene, the Latin letters, capital Latin letters, have been exhausted for the discovery of uncials, so he doesn't subtract anything, he adds to Wetstein's system. In addition to the capital Latin letters, he includes those capital Greek letters, which wouldn't be repetitive of the Latin system, which still is only going to give you 40 or 50 places to stick uncials in. You can go through the Latin alphabet, then you go through the Greek alphabet that's not repetitive of the Latin alphabet, and you end up with only 40 or 50 places to stick uncials in, which means if you discover 60 uncials, you have to go beyond that. And so we go beyond Tischendorf to Caspar René Gregory, 1846 to 1917. And he devised a 4-fold system, and so far I've only looked at the first of those aspects. He devised a 4-fold system for listing the manuscripts. Now here's where the little diagram, little chart up at the top of your paper will help you out in seeing the time period covered by various names of the manuscripts. So a fourfold system. In the first place, he had to deal with the papyri manuscripts, which we said right away would alert you to the fact you're dealing with the earliest available manuscripts, because we're going back to the 1st to the 4th century A.D. So these would be the manuscripts, obviously, that were written on pieces of papyrus. Without going through all of the history of papyri that we looked at last time, we'll simply give you what his designation was, and that was an Old German or Gothic P with a number for a superscript. Have you found out what a superscript is yet? It's just a little number to the right and a little bit above the letter P. If it's a subscript, then it's a number to the right and a little bit below the Old German or the Gothic P. So one would be a superscript. Super simply means above, and sub simply means under, like submarine means under the water. That's what the little things are for, to go under the water. So sub means under. If it's a subscript, it has to be a number, but it's going to be below the letter. And if it's a superscript, then it's still a number, but it goes above. So in other words, you'd have a P, then a little number to the right and slightly above it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. P1, P2. What would that refer to? Refer to manuscripts that were written on pieces of papyrus that dated from the 1st to the 4th century A.D. And then we said that during Gregory's day, he had 14 of them available. Not very many. We don't have very many available today. We're talking about something that's perishable to an extent that's greater than, say, parchment or paper or the printed page today would be. And besides that, not only are they more perishable than parchment would be, but they're a lot older. I mean, even if parchment was the 4th century, that's as early as we could go. Then papyrus could go as early as the 1st century, and you're separated by a half a millennium. Now you may want to start taking notes if you haven't been already, because we'll come up to tonight, which is things not repetitive of last week. The next group of manuscripts, by which he was going to give us his system of designation, he referred to as the uncials. Now, what potential problem do we have on our hands right away without saying anything yet? Papyri are written with uncials. So obviously, if we're going to use the word uncial, maybe not obviously, let me take the word back. From now on, it'll be obvious after I say it.
Amen.
If we're going to use the word uncial as a designation of New Testament manuscripts, then we're talking about parchment uncials and not papyrus uncials, which makes a distinction between the 1st and the 4th century and the 4th and the 10th. Otherwise, to say uncials, how do you know we're not talking about 1st or the 4th century? Uncials were used as the type of handwriting during that period, from the 1st to the 4th century. So this is just the way that he dreamed the system up, so it's the way you have to memorize it. Although there might be a little inconsistency here. I mean, you could call it parchment, but then you've got to deal with the parchment of the minuscules when you come to them. So you're going to end up with a problem either way you go. The safe thing to do is just memorize the difference. If we're talking about uncials as a system of designation, then we're not talking about the papyrus uncials, we're talking about the parchment uncials. Otherwise, when we use the word uncials, all we have reference to are capital Greek letters. Doesn't matter what period you're in. We're just talking about capital Greek letters. You could write a capital Greek letter today and call it an uncial letter. We call them capitals today, but it's still after the same process of the early uncial letters of the 1st to the 10th century. So there's the potential problem that you have to jump over to get past the papyri and get down to the uncials. So when we talk about the uncials, we have reference to manuscripts on parchment, not on papyrus, although the uncials were also on papyrus, but as a system of classification, we're talking about the manuscripts on parchment, we're talking about the 4th through the 10th centuries. The earliest of these manuscripts, the uncials, which would put us back in the 300s A.D., would be the earliest of this group of manuscripts. The earliest of these manuscripts are generally acknowledged to be the most reliable manuscripts of the New Testament. which means really more reliable than the papyri manuscripts. That will explain a reason for later on. Now the early uncials are very simple. Of course they're capital letters, but they're very simple. The letters are very simple without all of the ornamentation and color and pictures and design that you see in the later uncials as you get on up to the 800s to the 900s, and especially that you see in the minuscules from the 10th to the 14th century. And we'll show you some pictures of that whenever we actually get to the manuscript. So the uncials, we don't change Wettstein. They still go by capital Latin letters. We don't change Tischendorf. Before the Latin letters, you have to stick in Aleph. That stays the same. And again, we don't change Tischendorf. We keep the Greek letters, capital Greek letters that are different than Latin. But what about when you get down to the mid-40s and you run out of Latin and Greek letters? Then you have to go to another system. It's addition and not subtraction. The other ones stay the same. But then you go to another system, the system of Gregory, where in order to designate the uncials, you have a letter, you have a number, that's prefixed with a 0. And that includes not only what we call the numbered uncials, but it includes those that already have a letter as well. Which means that we go all the way back to Sinaiticus, to Alexandrinus, to Vaticanus, to Ephraemi, to Bizzi, to Claromontanus, to Basiliensis. We go back to all of these early uncials. They already have a letter to them, and now we're going to give them a number that's prefixed with a 0. In other words, 01, 02, 03, 04, and so forth. So you might want to get down a few examples. That means that, let's say that we had here with us Sinaiticus as an example, which we don't. But we can say that we had Sinaiticus here. Then Sinaiticus could be known and would be known by any or all of the following 3 designations. This is the very first manuscript. It could be known as Sinaiticus. That would be the name of the manuscript. It could be known, that would be Codex Sinaiticus. It could be known as Aleph, which we would owe to Tischendorf, or it could be known as Codex 01, which would be the scientific classification that Gregory gave us. And generally that's what you'll find, is 01, because it keeps all the confusion out about the names, and it keeps the confusion out about the letters. So we would go Sinaiticus, then we would have Alexandrinus, which would also be known as Codex A. You see, we use the Hebrew A, which is Aleph, but it's not the same as the Latin A. It's an A, but it's a different name, and you make it differently. So Alexandrinus would be known as Alexandrinus. It would be known as Codex A. And then what would the number be? 02. That's where I said you're going to be out of kink by one number each time when you've got a Latin letter. A doesn't go with 1, B doesn't go with 2. You'll be one ahead, in other words, in the numbers as compared with the letters.
Do they abbreviate codex? Or do they write codex?
They just write it out. C-O-D-E-X. They write the whole word out. It doesn't have a well-known abbreviation like manuscript does. So then we come to Codex Vaticanus, which would be Codex B, as well as Codex 03. Then Ephraemi would be C04, Bizzi would be D05, Claromontanus would be 06, Basiliensis would be 07. And you work your way all the way down to Codex 045, which is known as Arthus Dionysiou. And then what do you think the letter is going to be? Think back on what we've said thus far. This, just giving you these things doesn't prove whether you know what we're talking about or not. But you can already tell what the letter is going to be. And by the way, we're to the last of the lettered uncials now. We're on 045, which tells you how many lettered uncials. You see, you've got 2 classifications of uncials. Maybe you need to get this down under uncials. You've got what are known as the lettered uncials, which would go from Aleph to whatever letter it is that we're talking about now, which would also go from 01 to 045. It lets you know how many lettered uncials you'd have, 45, and then the numbered uncials, which would refer to all of the uncials known by a number, like the letters are known by, but without a letter before it, such as 046. You see, 046, And by the way, 046, guess what the name of that manuscript is? Vaticanus. It's the same as 03, Vaticanus, which means you're going to get confused. So is 028, which is known as Codex S, I believe. 028S is another Vaticanus manuscript. So you see, if you try to go by the names, you're going to get confused in a hurry. But you can keep a distinction between 03, 028, and 046, because 046 would be the first of the lettered, or the first of the numbered uncials that would be different from the letters. But anyway, I hope you're following me. Getting back to 045, we said that the name of it was Arthus Dionysiou, and then what's the letter of it?
Omega.
Omega. Very good. What would be the last Greek letter? You've gone through all the Latin ones, you go through all the Greek ones, the last available letter that an uncial could be known by. Jesus said, I am Alpha and Omega, the first and the last letter of the Greek alphabet. So Codex 045 would also be known as Arthus Dionysiou, and it would also be known as Codex Omega. Now, Omega would keep you straight here because we're not going to have any other ones. Arthus Dionysiou would keep you straight because we don't have any other compound, difficult names like that. A lot of difficult names, as you'll see the weeks to come, but not compound ones like Arthus Dionysiou. But it gets pretty confusing. Maybe you already are confused. Whenever you try to find out now, do we have a letter, do we have a number, or should I think of a name? The best thing to think of is the number, because that is what stays the same. All right, I'm going to keep on going unless someone stops me that you need review on something.
Would you repeat the names between Vaticanus 03 and Arthus Dionysiou?
Well, I didn't give you all of them. That'd be about 40 of them right there.
3 or 4.
I gave you some other ones. All right, which was the last one?
The next 3 after Vaticanus.
Vaticanus would be 03, then 04 is Ephraimi, Ephraemi. The next one is Bezae, Bezae. Then Claromontanus, just pretty much like it sounds. Do you have those down in the outline?
They're in the outline.
Some of them are in the outline. Claromontanus.
Yep.
Basiliensis was, I think, the next one, 07, which I believe is Codex E. Basiliensis is Codex E. Is that as far as I went? I think that's about, okay. We'll give you what all of them are in between there later on. Those are some of the more important ones because those are the initial ones that start the system off. Especially Sinaiticus, Alexandrinus, Vaticanus, Ephraimi, and Bezae, which would take us, I believe, up to 05, especially those. Those are the important ones. From Aleph to Codex D, or 05. Some of that might be on the outline, someone says. What page is that on? Okay, you've got Claromontanus there on page 9. I don't see Basiliensis. You need the spelling of that. Basiliensis. Basiliensis. That's just a sampling of them, by the way. They're on page 9. There's a lot more than that, just a sampling. Well, they're not in any particular order. You see that it starts off with Vaticanus because it's thought of as the greatest of the early ones, and Sinaiticus comes next, and then Alexandrinus, although really it should be Sinaiticus, Alexandrinus, and then Vaticanus. Then Ephraimi, then Bezae, then Codex Washington. I think that's like 30-something, if I remember correctly. So that's way down the list. Then you've got Bezae, number 6. Then you've got Claromontanus. Isn't it a lot easier to remember the numbers in these long names? Like Arthus Dionysiou, it's easier just to remember the number. Well, no one said amen. Maybe it's difficult for both of them. Well, that's why you need to be getting all this down so you don't have to have it memorized. So whenever you want to know something about a manuscript, then look up on your little homemade chart you have of what it's called, what it's about, and what it contains.
Amen.
So you don't have to try to memorize all the things. Okay, that would deal with the uncials. See, we're glad that Gregory did this for us. Because there are at least 3 manuscripts known as Vaticanus. 03, 028, and then 046, which would make it confusing if you didn't have the numbers to go along. You say, well, we'd have the letters. Well, by the time you get past 045, you're out of letters. So then you're in trouble again. I guess you could refer to that as the Vaticanus, the only one that doesn't have a letter. But it's easier just to remember the numbers that they go by. Now, the little Greek Bibles that we passed around last time, this is what can be found, and this is what you have to know how to recognize what manuscripts are being referred to. So that's probably enough on the uncials. Let's move on to the third group of manuscripts under Gregory's system, which would be known as the minuscules. Now, by far, these minuscules constitute the largest group of New Testament manuscripts. They generally date from the 9th to the 10th century onwards. And we've given you the date, or the dates for minuscules as being the 10th to the 14th, but you can find some 9th century minuscules. So they generally date from the 9th or the 10th century onwards. The vast majority of them are on parchment. But you could have one here and there on paper as you get towards the end of the minuscule period. Now, there's nothing really new to learn about minuscules. That's the same as what Wettstein said. The minuscules are known by Arabic numerals. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That doesn't change at all. See, I said last time that it was a disadvantage to ever work letters into the system because you run out of letters sooner or later. But if you get numbers in there and prefix them all with a 0, and then when you get to another group, prefix them all with a 1, and then another group, prefix them all with a 2, then you're in good standing because you can just go on and on and on talking about that group of manuscripts. And this is true with the minuscules. So the papyri, then the uncials, then the minuscules deal with the first 3 groups. And then Gregory gave us something else concerning these first 3 groups before we get to the 4th section. He gave us another system, the EACPR system, EACPR, to differentiate between the content of the manuscripts. Giving us a letter, giving us 0, 1, or just giving us 1 or something would tell us what type of manuscript. It's minuscule, it's papyri, if it starts with a P, or it's uncials. But then just because you have, let's say, P1, that doesn't tell you, well, what does P1 have in it? Does it have the Epistle of Jude? Have the book of Acts? Does it have Revelation? What does it have in it? So Gregory dreamed up another system, the EACPR system, to let us in on the content of that manuscript, where E would refer to the Gospels because of the popular name, the 4 evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The older name for the Gospels are the evangelists, would refer to the 4 Gospels. E would refer to the Gospels. A would refer to the book of Acts. EACPR. What would C refer to? We'll skip it for a minute. What would P refer to? Pauline epistles are Revelation. So back to C. What's left in the New Testament? The Catholic epistles. James and Peter and Jude and so forth. Now you need to get this down because when we put some things up on the overhead later on, we're going to put some things up tonight, but we're not going to cover that yet tonight. Then we're going to use Gregory's little system. Instead of telling you, now each one of these manuscripts contains so many books of the New Testament, you just have to go by the little EACPR system. And of course that still won't tell you now, if it's got E, does it have Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John? All it tells you is it's got something that's in E. So that shows you the area that that manuscript is directed to. Then you're going to have to study it yourself, or either look up in some book on that manuscript what it in its entirety contains, because maybe it's got John, maybe a part of John, but maybe not anything else besides that. So that's fairly easy to remember, EACPR. Okay, then the fourth and the final section of Gregory's system. Once you know this, then you know it all. Once you know this, I said, then you know it all. Not once you've been here to church. Once you know it, then you know it all. Fourth section is known as the lectionaries. Probably one of the most neglected of the aspects of Gregory's system, as well as New Testament documents in general. Not very much study is done. You search in vain to find any scholarly material on the lectionaries. Now, the lectionaries, they make up the second largest group of the New Testament manuscripts behind the minuscules. The minuscules are the largest group, followed by the lectionaries, followed by the uncials, followed by the papyri. The lectionaries are composed of what are known as lections, Lections, lections. Comes from the word to read. That's what a lecture is, talks or reads to you. Lections, which were selected portions of the New Testament that were read on specific days during the ecclesiastical year of each individual church. That's what the lections were. They were selected portions of the New Testament that were read on specific days. Now, by the way, this doesn't date back to New Testament times. This goes back to ecclesiastical times, the centuries after the first century, when Paul and John and the rest of them didn't have a little group of texts that they read on certain days or something like that. It sounds like the church. And sure enough, it's old denominationalism. Rising at the very beginning, they had little portions of Scripture that they read on specific holy days for that specific church, depending on what that church did during the year, during your ecclesiastical year. It wouldn't go from the 1st of January to the last of December. It would go on the basis of maybe the founding of your church or the birthday of the leader, the bishop of your church or something, where you'd set your ecclesiastical year up. And then you'd have these passages that were read on certain days. The vast majority of them read on Sunday mornings whenever they met together, which means you're not going to get a whole lot of reading done. And then you'd have in the margin of these books, you'd have in red ink, out in the lectionaries, you'd have in red ink what days you're supposed to read that passage on. So you could turn to the manuscripts and look for red ink, and if you find red ink, you probably got a lectionary. Most of these date from the 7th century onward, but we do have a few back to the 300s AD, the 4th century. And you see, the reason that we study this is not what we could really consider being on the same level as the papyri or the uncials or the minuscules, where people are copying the Bible because it is the Bible. They're copying it for ecclesiastical purposes. But nevertheless, what you end up with in your lectionary is a whole group of passages from the New Testament that have been copied. So, of course, someone's done the copying of it, but we still can go back and compare that to other manuscripts, look for new variants, look for variants that might be the same, try to iron out some difficulties. You wouldn't have, like we find minuscules, uncials, and so forth, Matthew just straight on through from chapter 1 to chapter 28. You'd have like Matthew chapter 2, some of the birth story and the early childhood of Jesus, a few verses from Matthew 2, then maybe something from Matthew 4 about the temptation, then maybe way over in chapter 27, something about the crucifixion. And so there would be a little lection from the Gospel of Matthew. We wouldn't have a lot of it, but we would have some of it. And then you'd go over in Acts and pick some of Acts out, maybe the founding of the church. And on certain holy days in the ecclesiastical year of the church, whenever it was the right time, depending on what the red ink in the margin said, then you read those portions of the New Testament. And in other words, rather than carry your Bible around, you carried your little lectionary around that was filled with lections. Not the whole New Testament, just selected portions of the New Testament, which ended up having people overemphasize certain passages and just completely forget about other ones because you didn't have your New Testament with you. You had a lection that your church had that someone stood up, or a lectionary that someone stood up and read the lections out of. Now we can divide the lectionaries up into 3 different categories as well. One category known as the Evangelion. Then another category known as the Apostolos. You'd have the Apostolos lectionaries, the Evangelion lectionaries. And then in the third place, you'd have a combination of the Apostolos Evangelion lectionaries. Evangelion. So you'd have Evangelion lectionaries, Apostolos lectionaries, and Apostolos Evangelion lectionaries, where you just combine the words together. Now, since we already gave you the EACPR system and what that means, then you ought to be able to take a guess anyway at what would be contained. By the way, this is another system to tell you the content of the lectionaries. What's contained in each one of these? What would be in the Evangelion lectionaries? The Gospels. What about Apostolos? Acts and the Epistles. Acts and the Epistles would be in the Apostolos. And then in the Apostolo Evangelion, you'd have some from the Gospels, some from Acts, and some from the Epistles. What's absent? Revelation, right. The lectionaries represent all of the New Testament many times over, except the whole book of Revelation and some portions of the book of Acts. If it got too boring, you wouldn't read it on Sunday morning. You'd skip over that. So the whole New Testament, in other words, if you gather together all 1997 or whatever of the lectionaries, you'd find the whole New Testament there represented many times over. You'd find Matthew 1:1 like 5 times, going through all of those 2,000 lectionaries. But there would be the whole book of Revelation that would be totally absent, not a verse found. They just stayed away from the book of Revelation. And then you'd find certain portions of the book of Acts that had simply been skipped over and couldn't be found in any of the lectionaries. In Gregory's day, they numbered 1,545. We're talking about just like a century ago. They numbered 1,545. Which brings us to another subject, the last subject we want to look at before we get into the manuscripts of the Old and New Testament. And that concerns the number of Old and New Testament manuscripts available today. We've been giving you some of the numbers available for Gregory during his time. But there's one final subject to look at before we get into talking about the Masoretes and the Dead Sea Scrolls and things like this, which we'll look into in some depth. Before we get to that, we want to take some time out to look at the numbers of the manuscripts, starting with the Old Testament, because as Paul said in one of his defenses, these things weren't done in a corner. Benjamin Kennicott, Kennicott. Benjamin Kennicott, we've mentioned his name before. In 1776, published the first major collection of Hebrew manuscripts. We're talking about the number of them now. The first major collection of Hebrew manuscripts, in which he had 615. Now, a manuscript might be a whole book, it might just be part of a book. Obviously, the vast majority would be just parts of a book and not a whole book. Then, shortly thereafter, in 1784, Giovanni de Rossi, R-O-S-S-I, published his collection of Hebrew manuscripts that contains 731. That's a jump of more than 100 in not even a decade. Not that that many had been discovered, just that Giovanni de Rossi knew of that many. In comparison to what Kennicott knew. Then in the late 1800s, this is a story we'll get into and tell you the background of later on, but in the late 1800s, really in 1890, there was a major discovery in an old synagogue in Cairo, Egypt. We'll give you the background of that and the men involved in another message, but Anyway, in this discovery in an old synagogue in Cairo, Egypt, they turned up 200,000 manuscripts, which were complete books and fragments of them. We're talking about Old Testament now, and of this 200,000, 10,000 of them were biblical in content. But you also have to make a note that practically, I probably could say every one of them is just like a fragment, a sentence or two, or maybe 5 sentences. We're not talking about like Dead Sea Scrolls where you have whole commentaries on the book of Habakkuk and things like this. A lot of it had decayed, and so you just have small fragments, but you could find enough so that you've got pieces of papyri that represented 200,000 manuscripts, of which 10,000 of them were biblical, which meant 10,000 were of Old Testament in their nature and content. Now, in the famous Dead Sea discovery, beginning in 1947 and continuing, by the way, all the way until right now, 600 manuscripts were discovered in the Dead Sea area. People refer to some of them as the Dead Sea Scrolls, but that's not all of them. I mean, that's just a handful of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But the Dead Sea discoveries comprise more than 600 manuscripts. And of course, not all of these were biblical. Then a couple of other statistics that I was able to dig up. The British Museum, which is the chief museum, the chief national museum in Great Britain, has a catalog which lists in their possession 161 Hebrew Old Testament manuscripts. Then another library at Oxford University, known as the Bodleian Library, has a catalog which lists 146 manuscripts. Now this Bodleian Library is very famous. It's a non-lending library. It's probably one of, well, it definitely it's one of the largest and one of the most important libraries, not only in England, but in all of the continent of Europe. It was founded way back in the early 1400s, early 15th century. It was disbanded for a while. The books were taken out by somebody. Even the shelves were torn down. But then a few years later, it was all restored and built back. Then I think back in the early part of the 17th century, like around 1610, they worked out an agreement. The people who were in control of the Bodleian Library, this is the library that belongs to Oxford University in England, they worked out an agreement with the government whereby they were promised, they were given the title to, or the right to, every book free of charge ever printed in England forever and ever. So they get every single book that's ever printed in England given to them free of charge. They're the only library in England anyway that's worked out a system like that. A lot of times things are donated to libraries. A lot of times you get to pay for books from a publisher at just a cut rate price. Well, we're talking about every book that's ever published in England since around 1610. If they want it, they don't have to take it. Obviously, you're going to run out of space if you take every book. But if they want it, they get a free copy. So it's significant that they have a catalog that lists 146 biblical Hebrew Old Testament manuscripts. Now in the United States, we've got many, many fragments, but none of these are the major ones, and we have very, very few that are complete copies of any portion of the Old Testament. They're just fragments. The United States as a country just came on the scene too late to cash in on all of the archaeological discoveries going on. And then we might sum up Old Testament numbers with the following statistic: the largest organized collection of Hebrew Old Testament manuscripts is found in the second Firkowitz collection in Leningrad. Firkowitsch, Firkowitz. He was a Karaite Jew who did a lot of discoveries. The Karaites are a famous Jewish sect, one of the oldest sects that repudiate rabbinic laws and targums and the Talmud and everything and just try to go straight back to the Word. There are about, I think, about 13,000 of them alive today. But anyway, Abraham Firkowitz that's who the collection is named after, did a lot of the discovering and the presenting to the Russian Public Library in Leningrad of these manuscripts, so it's known as the Second Furkowicz collection. There were two collections given, and the first one was absorbed into the second collection whenever Abraham brought more. In the Russian Public Library in Leningrad, where we have 1,582 items of the Bible and the Masorah on parchment, and 725 on paper. Now we compare that with British Museum catalog of 161. You see, there's a big difference there. Or the Bodleian collection of 146. Or Kennicott 615, or the other ones. And of all places, it's found in unbelieving Soviet Union. You ought to ship them over here. I mean, we'd make a lot more and better use out of them. 1,582 items of the Old Testament and the Masorah on parchment, and 725 on paper. Now that's pretty impressive. Paul said these things weren't done in a corner. But let's come to the New Testament, and it becomes even more impressive. Where we can start off by saying that the literary evidence for the New Testament is far greater in quantity and earlier in history than any other book that has ever been written. Now people want to say, well, how do you really know that the New Testament is true? How do you know Plato really existed? Except from the writings of Plato. Amen. How do you know Aristotle? How do you know Socrates? How do you know Epicurus really existed? How do you know these philosophers really? How do you know Julius Caesar really existed? Except from either his writings or writings about him. Yeah. People always want to say, you don't ever know about the New Testament. Who really knows? Well, we can start off by saying, and I'm fixing to prove it with statistics, that the New Testament, the manuscripts for it, they're greater in quantity, they're earlier in history. Two things we're going to make a point about: greater in quantity, earlier in history, than any other book that's ever been written in the history of mankind. Which includes, of course, the Old Testament. Okay, let's start with the history section. I said earlier in history. Now, what do we mean by that? We mean the time that elapsed between when it was written and when we have a copy of it. We don't have autographs of Caesar, of anybody. No autographs of anything. Those have all been destroyed centuries ago. But what about the time that elapsed between Julius Caesar wrote the Gallic Wars and when we have a copy of the Gallic Wars? It's dated. About 900 years. That's a big difference. Between the death of the Apostle John, let's just say around 100 A.D., and a copy of a portion of the Gospel of John in the year 125 A.D. 25 years. That's pretty reliable. How do you know Caesar even existed and all that was true when we've got a whole millennium that separates the time of Julius Caesar and when Caesar wrote his Gallic Wars? And yet, and the educated people know this, but I guess they like to sweep it under the rug because it makes the Bible much more a reliable book than any book that's ever been written. When you have such a short period of time that has elapsed between when it was written and when we have a copy of it. Amen. So let me give you some examples from other writings. Well, I just gave you Caesar's Gallic Wars. Everyone's heard of Julius Caesar. Everyone's heard of his, well, maybe not everyone, a lot of people's heard of Caesar's Gallic Wars when he galloped off to Spain to fight the Gauls, which is what Spain was known as, Gaul. Well, 900 years elapsed between the time of Julius Caesar when he wrote his Gallic Wars and when we have a copy that's extant of the Gallic Wars. 900 years. Think of all the copies of the copies of the copies. You see, the same thing happened with all other writings that happened with the New Testament. Copies of copies of copies of Caesar's Gallic Wars. And yet professors in school that major in Caesar and like to study Gallic Wars, they'd quote Gallic Wars as though it's inspired scripture. And yet I bet we could find more variants in Gallic Wars than you can find in the New Testament. Because it's so far separated between when Caesar wrote it, when we have a copy. In other words, there are probably just hundreds of corruptions that have entered into Gallic Wars that would never have entered into the New Testament.